Hello and welcome to the new Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski and I'll be your host on this adventure. In this podcast, we talk about faith and family and friends, finances, fitness, forte, fortress, foundations, and fun, which happens to be my F system for a living. I mean, I keep all my files organized that way. I keep my computer organized that way. It's kind of how I think about things and how I divide up my life. Most of what we talk about on this podcast is foundations, which has to do with what holds our community together, the foundations of our society. Although I do reserve the right to talk about any of the other F systems on this podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 things in the news. It's kind of become my habit to pull down 5 articles off of the internet and the interwebs, right? And as my daughter calls them, and find out some things and talk about them and kind of explore them. And the show is hosted, sponsored by Workplace Excellence. That's my company, myworkplaceexcellence.com. And I have a special way that you can support this podcast. I have created a link on Workplace Excellence, myworkplaceexcellence.com, where you can get a DISC assessment and 2 coaching sessions with yours truly for only $195. I have been a leadership management coach for 30 years, working in Fortune 50 companies, Fortune 500 companies, small mom and pops, and everything in between, individuals, groups, teams, with team training as well. But what I'm talking about here is just 2 sessions with a DISC assessment for only $195. Screaming deal. I'll talk about it more later in the podcast. And if you don't want to spend $195 to support the podcast and get a really cool DISC assessment and some coaching, you can use the Patreon link. We just started a Patreon account. And if you don't know how that works, you just go there and you sign up for, say, $2 a month or $5 a month or $10 a month or whatever to support the podcast. And for that, we just kind of spread it out across a lot of people, and we just started that. So if you want to support that way, be most grateful. The link is in the show notes down below. All right, let's jump into our first topic. And I'm going to try to set a timer here and keep it at a half an hour. That's my goal. But our first topic is from NOQreport.com. It's a Dinesh D'Souza piece, and he talked about the differences in the New York Times headlines on the day after Trump was acquitted versus the day after Bill Clinton was acquitted. Let me read you the headlines. Trump headline: Split Senate clears Trump on each count in finale of a bitter impeachment battle. Split Senate clears Trump on each count. Let's go back to the New York Times from when Clinton was acquitted. Clinton acquitted decisively. No majority for either charge. Both presidents had 2 articles of impeachment against them. On Mr. Trump's first article, 48 said guilty, 52 said not guilty. Kind of a party line vote, wouldn't you think? Article 3, 47 guilty, 53 not guilty. So both of them, 52, 53 not guilty. And yet the headlines reads, Split Senate clears Trump on each count. Well, let's go back to Mr. Bill Clinton's thing. Article 1, perjury, 45 guilty, 55 not guilty. Article 2, obstruction of justice, which he was suborning perjury. He was telling other people to lie. 50 said guilty, 50 said not guilty. There was a split vote on Bill Clinton. Now, if you recall from the last month, if you were paying attention to Chief Justice Roberts, he said that if there's a 50-50 vote, then it doesn't pass, right? So that happened with Bill Clinton. There was a 50-50 vote, and so he was not guilty. And yet the Times headline says, Clinton acquitted decisively. 50-50 vote is decisive, yes. Why am I bringing this up? Because words matter. The headlines matter, the news reports matter, what you hear on the radio matters. It impacts what you believe about things. I would like to call your attention to a book that came out in 2001 called The New Thought Police, written by Tammy Bruce. Tammy Bruce used to be the chapter president for the Los Angeles chapter of the National Organization for Women. Definitely a left-wing organization. And in this book, she talks about how she would correct reporters and journalists on words that they were using. For example, if somebody said pro-life, she would say, no, it's anti-choice. That kind of stuff. She talks about calling radio stations. She'd hear a news report and she'd call the radio station and say, no, you're reporting it wrong. And then the next news session, half an hour later, the guy would say it the way she told her to. So it's all about controlling the narrative, right? And the media has become like the talking points arm of the Democratic Party. They're like the public relations department for the Democrats. In fact, they're almost like the Democratic Army attack dogs, because if you see a Republican getting interviewed on TV, you have this Democratic, obviously we know these people are very left-leaning journalists. They're going, yeah, but you, yeah, but you, yeah, but you. And it's an attack. And they always try to put the conservative on the defensive. Well, not happening when you have a left-wing person. It's almost like saying, here's a softball, can I give you some ice cream? Here you go. And it's just this nice little cozy conversation. They attack conservatives though. Last week on the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro, Andrew Klavan, the guys over there, I forget which one of the guys said it. They said that we've been fighting Democrats and we need to be fighting the media. And I couldn't agree more. In fact, even Devin Nunes was on Laura Ingram's show this weekend, and he said the same thing. He says, we need to stop talking to the mainstream media because they're the enemy. I mean, there's a United States representative, Devin Nunes, saying that the media is the enemy, and I couldn't agree more. I say, yes, stop talking to the mainstream media, which we call the legacy media, and talk to the new media. I mean, talk to uncoverdc.com, talk to Breitbart, talk to Daily Wire, talk to Daily Caller, talk to any one of these, the Red State. There's so many conservative sites out there. And if you talk to them first, then CNN and Fox and MSNBC and everybody else has to say, well, according to, and they have to say the name of the new media. And so they have to validate the new media because you stop talking to the legacy media. So anyways, I just want to point this out, that the bulldog public relations department of the Democratic Party needs to be, as Nadler would say, brought to heel, because they are bulldogs. Yes, they're going to call us names. They're going to make personal insults. So why talk to them? You can't win with these people. They don't argue facts anymore. They just make slanderous comments. In fact, think about this. Remember we had the State of the Union this past week, and Rush Limbaugh received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And then after the State of the Union address, here's Jim Acosta from CNN saying, oh, well, this is really not good because Rush Limbaugh has been known to make racist comments. And he's trying to paint Rush as a racist and paint President Trump as a racist for giving him an award and how bad this is. What's hilarious is that Rush's producer, Bo Snerdley, got on social media and said, hey, Jim Acosta, where's the evidence? Because Bo Snerdley has been Rush's producer. He's been on Rush, affiliated with Rush since the beginning. And Bo Snerdley is black. And it's hilarious. He's like, hey, Jim Acosta, I'm calling for it. Where is the evidence? And Jim Acosta hasn't been saying anything. So it's almost like option A. Jim Acosta is an unethical liar who was caught. Or option B, option A is true. Which is it, Jim? You tell me. All right. Let's move on to item number 2. Item number 2 on my list of 5 is actually a tweet from Senator Jerry Moran. He said after the impeachment was over, he says, it became clear over the course of the House manager's arguments that the House failed to undertake its responsibility to collect supporting evidence. And the managers continually attempted to shift that evidentiary responsibility to the Senate, which is exactly what happened. And then he got all sorts of pushback from other Twitter people saying the House was denied the opportunity to investigate because of Trump's obstruction. So your vote to deny witnesses, you will let Trump actually be above the law, a critical misjudgment. And then Mr. David Brokaw tweeted, and who knows if it's Tom Brokaw's relation, but he said, they issued several subpoenas and document requests that your president blocked and ignored. And something I don't want to say. He says, your party was a miscarriage of justice, so awful that Lady Justice is now barren and may never recover. If anybody is believing this tripe, that the House was denied opportunity to fully investigate, you may or may not have heard this, and I may or may not have talked about it, but I'm going to talk about it again. These subpoenas that were issued by the House did not have any teeth. And that's because Nancy Pelosi didn't have a House vote on the forward movement for impeachment. There was no vote from the House to say, let's move forward on impeachment. After Schiff came out with his big fake transcript and oh, the danger, oh, the horror, within a day or two, Nancy Pelosi just unilaterally decides we're going to have impeachment investigations on these various committees. Well, you know what, Nancy? You didn't have a vote. So that means the subpoenas that these committees were issuing to investigate impeachment proceedings didn't have any legal teeth. So when people were getting these subpoenas, there was a story where one guy from the White House goes to a judge to ask, do I have to comply with this? And they didn't have to because there was no official vote. In fact, one of the guys on the committee went over to the courthouse, ran over there and said, we withdraw that subpoena because they didn't want the judge to rule, and then the press would have to report that the impeachment didn't have any weight to it. So it really was not a legitimate investigation. There was no fairness happening in the House. They tried to tell us that this was all done on the Clinton model. They set this all up following the Clinton model. They didn't. The Clinton model, there was 4 years of investigation on Bill Clinton's issues. 4 years. Against Trump, 48 days. In the investigation in the House, Clinton was allowed to have his lawyer present. Trump was not. Adam Schiff said, no, you can't have your lawyer present. In Clinton, his lawyer could cross-examine the witnesses. And when they were doing depositions, he could cross-examine. There was nothing. Nobody could ask questions unless Adam Schiff said approved of the question. Nothing was released. Nobody could call witnesses. I was watching some of the proceedings, and there's under Jerry Nadler's committee, and one of the Republican representatives said, I want to call witnesses. And Jerry Nadler says, you'll be able to call witnesses after we vote on moving forward with these articles of impeachment. What kind of trial is that? There was no fairness in any of that. So then you have all these there's a total setup, by the way, because they rushed this through. We've got our impeachment thing. Now what do we do with it? Then they get it over to the Senate. And the senators were told that the Democratic senators were set up to call witnesses, knowing that the Republicans weren't going to call any, and then being able to claim that there was no fair trial. You had Kamala Harris and everybody else out there saying there's no fair trial, so therefore he's not officially acquitted because there was no trial. The trial should have taken place by examining the evidence that the House presented. The House didn't do all their work, and they expected the Senate to do it, and the senator from Kansas is absolutely correct, trying to shift evidentiary responsibility over to the Senate. So if they try to tell you, if anybody of your friends try to tell you that it wasn't fair, it wasn't a fair trial, here's a couple questions you can ask them. You could say, in a fair trial, is due process part of the fair trial? In a fair trial, is the accused supposed to be able to face his accuser? In a fair trial, isn't the accused supposed to be able to call witnesses? In a fair trial, shouldn't they be able to do cross-examination? obviously in a fair trial in our court of laws in our country, this is all fair. This is all due process stuff. But none of that was allowed. So it really wasn't a fair trial in the House. And when there's no due process, when there's a violation of due process, then the accused can't get charged on those issues. If you got a guy who does a crime and the cops go to his apartment and they bust him with no warrant and they go through his sock drawer and they find evidence and they go to the court to present that evidence, the judge is going to say, sorry, you didn't have a warrant. Inadmissible, can't take it. And he wouldn't be able to be charged on that. There's no conviction allowed with that kind of evidence because of violation of due process. So when the committees run by Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler violated Trump's due process, there should have been a dismissal right away. And the only reason the Senate Republicans went forward was so that they couldn't argue, well, you never had nothing. They listened to the evidence, and it was a hoax, total sham, set up from the beginning. All right. All I'm trying to say in all of that is ask some questions. Ask questions when people say it wasn't a fair trial. Get them to define what a fair trial is. All right. Let's move on to item number 3. Presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren was in the news recently at lifenews.com. Micaiah Bilger is the author. The headline, Elizabeth Warren would fire every single pro-life Trump administration official. Interesting, given today, when I'm recording this, that the big hoopla that yesterday when I was Nancy Pelosi came out. She was stunned that President Trump would reassign Vindman and recall Ambassador Sondland. You've got Trump has the right to set up however he wants things to be. He's the president. It's his branch of the government to run. And everybody's so shocked that he would do this. It's vindication. Not vindication. It's retribution. So let me read you this article. So that's the tone in Washington right now is how horrible. Listen to Elizabeth Warren. She, if elected, she would weed out pro-life employees who Trump appointed to federal agencies. According to Warren's plan, her administration would, quote, ask for the resignations of all political appointees, including U.S. attorneys, except for those positions necessary to preserve continuity and protect national security during the transition period. After that, they'd all be gone. Interestingly enough, the abortion industry is going to benefit big time from that, and they're dumping tens of millions of dollars into this campaign. So why do our tax dollars get handed to Planned Parenthood? Every tax dollar going to Planned Parenthood should be stopped. We should not be funding these people, especially when they then donate only to Democratic candidates. During a November presidential debate, Senator Warren says that she believes that abortion rights are human rights, and she would fight for abortion if elected. And she thinks that Medicare should pay for abortions. And she consistently has said that she supports taxpayer-funded abortions without restriction. And she opposes even modest limits on any abortion after the unborn baby still is viable. So, for example, during the State of the Union, there was this 2-year-old kid who was born at 21 weeks. She was 21 weeks in the womb, and then she was born. It's a viable baby, viable unborn baby. And yet, Elizabeth Warren says, nope, we can take that person out. You know what? On the surface, when you just listen to these words, a woman's right to take care of her own body, I say, yes, absolutely. Every human being has a right to take care of their own body. Here is the problem. When a woman undergoes abortion, she's not aborting herself. She's aborting somebody else. Think about that. Think about that. I personally think that anybody considering abortion should be forced to watch a abortion video so that they know what they're getting themselves into and what they're doing. All right, let's take a little break here and tell you that our show is sponsored by Workplace Excellence, which you can find at myworkplaceexcellence.com, a company run by me. And like I said at the beginning of the show, I've been an executive management leadership coach for 31 years now. And in fact, one of my previous clients went on to become the CEO of Motorola. I work with people in all industries and even people who are not working, just even stay-at-home moms. I help them understand themselves with self-awareness, self-management, work management, relationship management. That is the key to success in today's business world, emotional intelligence. And understanding yourself is the foundation of emotional intelligence. I've been teaching EQ since before EQ was even a thing. I was doing this back before the book came out in '96. So if you want to learn more about yourself and where your strengths are and the potential blind spots for those strengths, get this deal: a DISC assessment, behavioral style assessment, and 2 coaching sessions with me for only $195. Just go to myworkplaceexcellence.com to get that screaming deal, because you're not going to find that deal anywhere else. If you don't want to spend that kind of money, but you still want to support the podcast, do visit the Patreon link in the show notes. Thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate that. All right, let's move on to the final 2 issues in our podcast here. Number 4, our friend AOC is in the news again. I think she likes being in the news. Alexandria Occasional Cortex says it is physically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah, we know that. It's because it's an idiom, and Alexandria. I'm watching this, and I didn't catch what was said before she went off on this rant. I'm guessing there was some testimony on one of her committees where somebody said that they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And I had to remember, why would AOC go off on this rant? And she was a bartender. She was a lower middle class bartender who got recruited by Justice Democrats, a far left socialist Marxist organization, who recruited people that they could groom, that could do the talk and look the look. And she didn't even believe in herself. Her brother had to goad her into auditioning for this, and they selected her, and that's how she ended up becoming a United States representative. True story. Anyways, I can just picture AOC tending bar one night and people talking about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and AOC going, well, what does that mean really, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, huh? And so somebody says, well, it started off as a joke, because it did. Back in the early 1800s, it was a joke. Because you really can't, she's absolutely right. She says, let me quote you what she said. She goes, this idea of a bootstrap, this idea, this is a metaphor of a bootstrap, started off as a joke because it's a physical impossibility to lift yourself up by a bootstrap. It's physically impossible. It's like, hello, AOC. Yes, we know this. Fun facts to know and tell across the bar, right? It's an idiomatic phrase that has to do with, it's actually a term of respect now. And maybe you were dissing somebody pulling themselves up by their bootstrap, because I wouldn't put it past you. But the phrase means to begin an enterprise or to recover from a setback without any outside help. In other words, to succeed by your own efforts or abilities. That's what it means, AOC. It's an idiom. And apparently you got a big problem with idioms now. So let's just go through a few idioms that maybe AOC should never, ever use ever again, such as beat around the bush. AOC, don't ever want to hear you say that ever again in your life, because beat around the bush is a hunting phrase. When they had birds hiding in bushes back in the 1400s and 1500s, and they would go beat the bushes, beat around the bushes, and the birds would flush out, and then they could shoot them. You're pretty anti-gun, AOC. I don't think you should be saying that phrase anymore. That's pretty ghastly. How about pay through the nose? That has to do with enslaving a population and enacting a tax on them. And they had to pay by the nose, so you're paying through the nose. Classism and slavery. Don't ever use that phrase ever again, AOC. And then there's pulling the wool over somebody's eyes, which has to do with the English time of where they wore the powdered wool wigs, and they would pull it over your eyes, which is an act of bullying. So don't ever use that phrase, AOC. And I don't ever want to hear you say high on the hog either, because high on the hog That means if you were wealthy enough to afford the good meat on a pig, which is always the upper end of the pig, the back straps, then you were living high on the hog. So that's more classism right there. And of course, cruelty to animals. And then costing an arm and a leg, you're insulting amputees. And then speak of the devil. We shouldn't be hearing you say that phrase because, well, I take that back. Maybe you do know him, and so I shouldn't say anything. So let me just say that I understand that in New York, your particular district might get eliminated. Because of New York's high taxes, they're talking about eliminating a district in New York, and it might be yours. So if and when you ever go back to bartending, just remember, AOC, that the best martinis are 3 shots of Tanqueray, 1 shot of vodka, half a shot of Lillet, and a slice of lemon, shaken, not stirred. Let's move on to the final episode here of our 5 topics. Mr. Chris Matthews is in the news. This is off theblaze.com. If you know Chris Matthews, he's been on hardball. He's the left-wing guy, Mr. Thrill up his leg because of Obama. Chris Matthews, that guy. He was in New Hampshire this past Friday night on a panel, post-debate special with New Hampshire voters. And there's this video that I linked to in the show notes. And by the way, all the stuff that we talk about is linked in the show notes if you want to go read more about them. But you got to watch this video. It's hilarious because you're thinking Chris Matthews swallowed a red pill. It's like even everybody else on the panel got their eyebrows up looking at Chris going, what's up with you? Let me tell you what happens here. He's on this panel and he starts venting about Joe Biden. And he says, and I quote, everybody's going to ask the tough questions about he and his son. They're going to ask, why does your son got this job over there making X number of millions of dollars? Why? When you've got the portfolio for Ukraine and then he got the contract for Ukraine. People would be mindless not to say, what's going on here? It's a reasonable question. This is Chris Matthews. Thrill up his leg, Chris Matthews. And it's hilarious because you got to watch everybody on the panel and they're looking at Chris where they got their eyes raised like, you okay? In fact, the link that we're going to send you to in the show notes is a tweet from Justice Democrats who are socialist Marxists, right? And their comment on this video is, you okay, Chris? It's like you've gone off the rails, Chris. So why you dissing so hard on Joe? Joe's supposed to be off limits. Remember, Joe's campaign sent out this memo that all these accusations have been debunked. All the news media have been saying it's debunked, and yet you're saying it. Oh my gosh, you okay, Chris? Well, he wasn't done. He was not done. And you're watching this, you're going, my gosh, maybe he had a whole bottle of red pills. Let me read you what he said. He says, the issue of this campaign, that word is socialism. Some people like it. Younger people like it. Those of us like me, who grew up in the Cold War and saw some aspects of it, as like visiting places like Vietnam like I have and seen countries like Cuba being there, I've seen what socialism's like. And I don't like it, okay? Not only is it not free, it doesn't frickin' work. I've got my own views about the word socialist, and I'll be glad to share them with the Democratic Party in private. They can go back to the early 1950s. I have an attitude about them. I remember the Cold War. I remember the attitudes about Castro. I believe that if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park. And I might have been the ones being executed. And certain other people would have been there cheering, okay? So I got a problem with people on their side. And this is Chris Matthews just ranting. I just read you what the transcript is. My gosh, Chris, did you take the red pill? I got a theory on that. I'll get to in a second. It made me think, though, as I'm watching this for the first time, going, Dave Rubin used to be a gay millennial leftist. Now he's just a gay millennial. He calls himself a classical liberal. And I would probably actually say the same thing about myself. A libertarian is a classical liberal. And Ronald Reagan said that the heart of republicanism, the heart of the conservative movement is libertarianism. It's classical liberal, not modern day progressive socialist liberal. So Dave Rubin's actually come around. But he used to be with the Young Turks, very left wing, very much in bed with the social justice warriors, the Justice Democrats. And one day, Dave Rubin, with the Rubin Report, took a position that was off the Democratic plantation, and they just fringed him. He's like, "Can't I have an opinion to myself?" And they're like, "No, you can't." They totally fringed him. And since that time, he's been hanging around with Jordan Peterson and having good discussions with Ben Shapiro, and he's basically moved to this classical liberal, almost conservative position. My wife listens a lot to the Daily Wire podcast. Ben Shapiro, Andrew Klavan, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles. And what she really likes about them is that they can have disagreements and nobody gets fringed, even amongst themselves. They can both have a podcast segment on a specific news item, and one takes one approach and another guy takes a different approach, and they're both convinced that they're right, but they don't fringe each other. Yet on the Democratic plantation, that doesn't happen. I think even Mayor Pete came out this last month and said, you can't be pro-life and be a Democrat. I think it was Mayor Pete. What kind of line is that? You can't think for yourself. You can't have an opinion differently than what we have, this little Democratic. You can't step off the plantation. I think Marianne Williamson, presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, had a very similar experience. She went off the plantation, said something, wanted to do something that they didn't approve of, and they castigated, they excoriated her. And she was on interview, said, I didn't think the left was so mean. I didn't think the left lied like this about her. I thought the right did that. I thought we were better, her being a leftist. Yeah, well, Marianne, welcome to Understandingsville. Understanding that reality is not the Democratic plantation. Lots of stuff out there. Don't be fringed. By the way, Chris, if you decide that you want to go red pill, just go talk to Dave Rubin. Maybe you guys can get in the boat and row together. Here's what I think is going on with this Chris Matthews thing, though. I don't think he got red pilled. I think that the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, wants to have Elizabeth Warren as their nominee. They don't want Bernie. Look at all the media that's out there right now just dissing Bernie. I just watched something with Michael J. Fox, where he said he's a big Mayor Pete guy. He said he's dissing Bernie openly. I mean, why, not just pro Mayor Pete, he's dissing Bernie. There's so many people in the news now on the left dissing Bernie, including Chris Matthews. I think this is part of a planned attack to try to dissuade voters from voting for Bernie Sanders. Just like I talked about in the first part of the show, with all the media coming, the word choices and all that, you got to come out against Bernie, and hopefully people will vote against Bernie. That's what I think. I also don't think that Mayor Pete's going to get the nod either. So I stand by my prediction that I made a few podcast episodes ago. I think Elizabeth Warren is going to get the nod. You can go back and listen to previous podcasts. George Soros is behind her. Creepy Uncle Joe is going to fall off the face of the map. He's just a vacuum right there. He's lost it. People have lost faith in him. That leaves Elizabeth Warren with the nod. So we will wrap up the podcast with that. And I want to thank you for listening in. And if you want to follow what I'm doing, you can go down below if you're watching this on YouTube and click that red subscribe button. And then next to that is going to be a little bell. You click on that bell and click the word all. Then you're going to get notified every time we release a new podcast. So I would encourage you to do that, because I'm not regular with setting these podcasts up. They vary depending on what time of the day and what day of the week. If you want to send me an email, let me know some of your thoughts that way. You can use New Book of Daniel daniel.outlook.com. Or you could leave some comments in the show notes down below. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's @NewBookOfDaniel, @NewBookOfDaniel. If you'd like to follow my political writings, go to uncoverdc.com. And uncoverdc.com is a little magnifying glass in the upper right-hand corner. Just click that, type in my last name, Bobinski, and everything that I've written on Uncover DC will pop up, which you can then read and share with your family and friends. So with that, thank you so much for listening. This is the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski. Feel free to contact me with any questions you've got. Until then, we'll see you on the next show.